there and welcome. I'm Cassidy Cash, and this is That Shakespeare Life. I run a podcast all about the history of William Shakespeare and his life in turn of the 17th century England. Today, I'm going to share with you a snippet from our latest podcast conversation. But before we get started, I wanted to take a second and say thank you to our patrons. A huge, big thank you to making today's show possible. This week's guest only agreed to be a part of our show because our podcast is completely free and available to listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. That means that those of you who sign up to support our work on Patreon and help us continue the legacy of William Shakespeare are directly responsible for us being able to meet with our guests today. Thank you so much. If you enjoy Shakespeare history, if you enjoy 16th and 17th century England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, then you will enjoy being a patron of our show. You can sign up to help us create episodes just like the one you're going to learn about today by being a patron at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. In Shakespeare's play Twelfth Night, there's a reference to a specific map. Maria mentions, quote, a new map showing what she calls the augmentation of the Endies. It turns out that the map Maria is talking about is a real map that was making quite a splash in popular culture for Shakespeare's lifetime in 1599 when the map was first published. To understand exactly who made this map, what it looked like, as well as why Shakespeare would use it in his play, we sat down with Peter Barber, former head of the maps collections at the British Library, and here's what he had to say about this specific 1599 map that Shakespeare was writing about in Twelfth Night. Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, there's a quote where Maria says, he does smile his face into more lines than is in the new map with the augmentation of the Endies, end quote. Peter, Twelfth Night was first performed in 1602. Was there a new map created around this time that included an augmentation of the Endies that Shakespeare might be referring to with this line?
There was indeed. It was a map which is now extremely rare by a man called Edward Wright, who combined the Mercator projection, which is what we're familiar with today on modern maps, with the traditional hydrographic sea chart, which contained what's called rhumb lines, which look like sort of compass lines going from a compass. In fact, they sort of trace winds and were compositional aids. But if you can imagine it, the lines of the Mercator projection were superimposed on these rhumb lines to create an awful lot of lines. And I think that's what Shakespeare was referring to. This map of 1599, with all of the lines and so on, also sort of implicitly is a map of the latest state of knowledge. So as well as being a scientific representation of the world, it does, you know, as Shakespeare said, show the augmentation of the Indies. There's more of the Indies there than was on earlier maps. And this particular map was published in 1599. So, you know, the Shakespeare play comes out in 1601, 1602. So he's writing it in about 1600. So it really is very, very new.
So a very contemporary reference.
A very contemporary reference. It actually says a lot about how up-to-date Shakespeare was and what his interests were. And it's particularly interesting for this map because this map, even without Shakespeare's reference, would be one of the most important maps produced by an English person at that time in Shakespeare's lifetime. And it is now extremely rare. So it just shows, you know, something like 95% of the maps, of the printed maps that Shakespeare would have been familiar with, are now lost. And many of the maps that he used are totally unknown today.
Peter writes that, quote, by 1600, maps, atlases, globes, and charts had become part of the fabric of everyday life of the wealthy and middling sorts, so common indeed that Shakespeare or Donne could confidently derive allegories from them in their plays and poems without fear of being misunderstood, end quote. The combination map that you just referenced is one example of this, Peter, but I wonder, are you saying that the average person in Shakespeare's London would have known how to read or consult maps on a regular basis?
by 1600, they probably would, but let's go into that a bit. When you talk about average, you're not talking about laborers, workmen who are illiterate. You're talking about people who can read. And by 1600, maps had been around long enough, or printed maps had been around long enough for most people to be familiar with them. And we know this because across the channel in the Dutch Republic, the various Dutch provincial governments at about this time were producing copper coins called tokens or jettons, which were meant for everyday use. And quite often they had a design of a map on them. And unless the people for whom they were intended, i.e., literate shopkeepers and so on, knew what a map was, it wouldn't have had any effect. So that's a sort of an acid way of assessing map literacy. But in the 1550s, for instance, then it would have been rather different.
You've just seen 2 of the 10 questions we discussed with Peter Barber about maps, cartography, rum lines, navigation, 16th century English maps, and so much more. You can hear our entire conversation about the history of maps in Shakespeare's lifetime completely free right now on the website at cassidycash.com/episode 217. That's cassidycash.com/EP217. You can hear the entire history, and there is also some extra links and bonus history over there where you can see some of the resource Peter mentions in the full show today. So find all of that over on the website. Now, there is some bonus visual content that coordinates with today's conversation, including pictures of the Makata map that Peter talks about, along with the ones by John Speed and Christopher Saxon, as well as some other famous 16th century map makers that we discuss in the full episode today. You can sign up to be a patron to access all of these bonuses. Those are inside what's called the detailed show notes that includes in-depth history, woodcuts, portraits, paintings, all of these illustrated maps that we talked about. Those are provided in the detailed show notes, along with all of the research that went into behind the scenes of putting today's show together. You can unlock that using the giant orange Patreon button right there on the cassidycash.com/episode 217 website. That's also the place you can join to be a patron if you're not already, to immediately expand the post and open up the bonus content. Or if you just want to support us directly on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. There's all kinds of bonuses there available for supporting our show. That's it for this week. Thank you for being here. Thank you for learning about maps along with me this week. This is really fun conversation. I'm excited to share it with you, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.